The old firefighter spent 40 years saving strangers, but retirement left him alone with his nightmares. When fire threatened his young neighbor, his last rescue attempt wasn't just about saving the boy. What happened afterward gave him something he never expected to find again. Frank Morrison's hands tightened around the steering wheel of his pickup truck as he drove past Station 47. The red brick building hadn't changed in the 3 years since his retirement. Same garage doors, same flagpole, different faces inside. He slowed down, checking his watch. 7:45 a.m. Shift change. The bay doors opened with a mechanical groan. Engine 47 backed in, its red paint dulled by ash and water spots. Frank's throat tightened. For 40 years, he'd been the one behind that wheel, guiding the massive truck into its spot with a precision that came from thousands of repetitions. "Get it together, old man," he muttered, pressing the gas. His knee ached as he accelerated, a souvenir from his last fire. The one he didn't want to think about. The morning sun hit his eyes as he turned onto Oak Street. His house sat where it always had, a 2-story colonial with white paint that needed touching up and gutters that needed cleaning. Sarah, his wife, used to tend to the flower beds out front. Now weeds pushed through the mulch. Frank parked in the driveway, grabbed his grocery bag, and limped up the front steps. The house creaked as he entered, its emptiness pressing against his ears. His footsteps echoed on the hardwood floor Sarah had insisted on installing 15 years ago. "I'm home," he announced to no one. Pictures lined the walls of the entrance hall. Frank in his dress blues receiving commendations, his kids graduating college, Sarah in her garden. A layer of dust covered each frame. He should clean them. Tomorrow, maybe. In the kitchen, Frank put away his groceries. TV, dinner, coffee, bread. He'd never learned to cook. Sarah had handled that. The coffee maker gurgled to life, filling the silence with its familiar rhythm. The morning paper waited on the kitchen table, crossword puzzle untouched. Frank settled into his chair, pen ready. The routine helped. Structure the day. Keep moving forward. 4 letters. Word for regret, he read aloud. His voice sounded wrong in the quiet house. A siren wailed in the distance. Frank's head snapped up, body tensing automatically. The sound grew louder, closer. He stood, crossed to the window. The ambulance screamed past his house, lights flashing. His hands shook as he poured his coffee. Black, no sugar. The mug Sarah had given him for their 30th anniversary. World's best firefighter in faded letters. The crossword lay forgotten as another siren cut through the morning. Engine 47. Frank knew the sound of his old truck, but it was taking longer to arrive than it should. Budget cuts had closed Station 39 last month. Response times were up. A moving truck rumbled down the street, brakes squealing as it stopped next door. The Henderson place, empty since old Tom passed in the spring. Frank watched through his kitchen window as a woman stepped out of a small sedan parked behind the moving truck. Mid-30s, hospital scrubs, dark skin. A boy around 10 hopped out of the passenger side, all energy and motion. "Marcus, be careful with those boxes," the woman called out as the boy grabbed a cardboard box from the truck. "I got it, Moms." The boy's voice carried through Frank's window. The box looked too heavy for his small frame. Frank's hand tightened around his coffee mug. The boy was going to drop it. Going to hurt himself. He should go help. Should introduce himself. Should. The box slipped. The boy caught it against his chest, stumbling but staying upright. "What did I just say?" His mother rushed over, taking the box. "Go get the lighter ones." Frank turned away from the window. The crossword puzzle stared up at him. 4 letters. Word for regret. Loss. The answer was loss. Night fell early, as it always did in late September. Frank moved through his evening routine, microwave dinner, evening news, pills for his knee. The TV droned in the background as he settled into his recliner. The dreams always came worse at night. Smoke and heat and screaming. The young mother trapped in that apartment fire 3 years ago. He'd been so close. If his knee hadn't given out on those stairs. Frank jerked awake, heart pounding. The TV was showing a commercial for life insurance. His shirt stuck to his back with sweat. The mail he collected earlier sat unopened on the coffee table. Bills, junk, and an official-looking envelope from the city. He knew what it contained. More budget cuts. More station closures. More distance between people who needed help and those who could provide it. His house felt too big around him. 5 bedrooms for one person. Sarah had wanted a big family. They'd had 2 kids, both living out of state now. Christmas visits and occasional phone calls. Maybe it was time to sell. Move into one of those retirement communities they kept sending him brochures for. Games of bridge and early bird specials. Through the wall, he heard laughter from next door. The boy, Marcus, saying good night to his mother. Normal sounds of family life that used to fill his own home. Frank stood, joints protesting. In the hallway mirror, he caught his reflection. Gray hair, lined face, eyes that had seen too much. 40 years of running into burning buildings while others ran out. 40 years of victories and losses, lives saved and lives lost. He climbed the stairs to his bedroom, their bedroom. Sarah's side remained untouched. Her reading glasses still sat on the nightstand. 3 years, and he couldn't bring himself to change anything. The sirens had stopped for the night, but Frank knew they'd return. They always did, and each time, his body would remember what it meant to be the one answering that call. His mind would replay every rescue, every failure. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. On the other side of the wall, he could hear the faint sounds of his new neighbors settling in. A child's laughter, a mother's voice. Life continuing, as it always did. The darkness pressed in around him, thick with memories. Tomorrow would be the same. Coffee, crossword, silence. The routine that kept him moving forward, one day at a time, in a house too big and too empty, haunted by the ghosts of who he used to be. The morning air bit cold against Frank's face as he started his daily walk. Doctor's orders, keep the knee moving. 3 blocks down, 3 blocks back. Same route every day. A red ball bounced across his path, rolling to a stop against his shoe. Frank bent to pick it up, his knee cracking like dry wood. Sorry, mister. Marcus ran across the lawn, stopping short when he saw Frank's face. The boy shifted his weight from foot to foot, uncertain. Hey! Frank held out the ball. His voice came out rougher than he intended, rusty from disuse. Marcus approached slowly, like you might a strange dog. Thanks. He grabbed the ball and backed away 2 steps. I'm Marcus. Frank Morrison. He gestured to his house. I live next door. I know. Mom says you're the retired firefighter. Marcus hugged the ball to his chest. Did you really save 100 people? Frank's chest tightened. Wasn't keeping count. Marcus. His mother's voice cut through the morning air. She hurried across the lawn in blue scrubs, hospital ID badge swinging from her neck. I'm so sorry, Mr. Morrison. He knows better than to bother the neighbors. No bother. Frank cleared his throat. And it's just Frank. Sarah Williams, she held out her hand. Her grip was firm, professional. I'd love to chat, but I'm running late for my shift. Marcus, Mrs. Chen will be here in 10 minutes to watch you. Homework first, then play. Okay. Mom. Sarah rushed to her car, calling over her shoulder. Nice to meet you, Frank. The boy lingered, bouncing his ball against the ground. Mom says you live alone. Marcus. Sarah's voice carried from the car. Give Mr. Morrison his space. Frank watched them drive away, Sarah's sedan disappearing around the corner. Through his kitchen window later, he saw Mrs. Chen arrive, a small Asian woman in her 60s who watched Marcus after school. The neighborhood gossip machine was already running at full speed. Frank heard it at the grocery store that afternoon. Single mother, Mrs. Patterson whispered to Mrs. Rodriguez by the produce. Working all hours at the hospital. That poor boy, barely supervised. Did you see how he was climbing that tree yesterday? Someone's going to get hurt. Frank grabbed his TV dinner and walked away. But an hour later, he heard yelling from next door. Get down from there. Marcus, please. Mrs. Chen's voice carried clear through Frank's open window. He looked out. Marcus had climbed the old oak tree that straddled their property line. About 20 feet up, an orange cat sat on a branch, just out of reach. I can get her. Marcus stretched toward the cat. Frank was moving before he thought about it. Out his door, across the lawn. His knee screamed with each step. Son, he called up. That branch won't hold you. Marcus looked down, startled. The branch creaked under his weight. But Butterscotch is stuck. Stay still. Frank studied the tree, old instincts kicking in. I'm coming up. Mrs. Chen wrung her hands. Mr. Morrison, your knee. Frank ignored her, grabbing the lowest branch. His body remembered this, even if it protested. 40 years of climbing ladders, scaling walls, reaching people who needed help. The bark was rough under his hands. His knee joint ground with each movement. But he kept climbing, keeping his breathing steady like he'd learned in the department. "Easy now," he said as he reached Marcus's branch. The cat watched them both with yellow eyes. "Let me show you something." Frank pulled a peppermint from his pocket. He always carried them, habit from quitting smoking years ago. He unwrapped it slowly, the crinkle of cellophane catching the cat's attention. "Cats are curious," he explained to Marcus. "You don't chase them. Let them come to you." He held out the candy wrapper. Butterscotch inched forward, whiskers twitching. In one smooth motion, she moved close enough for Frank to grab her scruff. "Down you go, little lady." He handed the cat to Marcus. "Now climb down, slow and steady." Back on the ground, Mrs. Chen hugged the boy and cat together. "Thank you, Mr. Morrison. I was so worried." Frank's knee throbbed. He'd pay for this tonight. But watching Marcus clutch his cat, face split in a wide grin, made it worth it. Later, as Frank iced his knee in his recliner, he noticed things about the Williams house. Missing downspout that could cause water damage. Branches too close to the power lines. Old smoke detector visible through the kitchen window, probably needed new batteries. Sarah's car pulled in around 8. Frank watched through his window as she hugged Marcus, listened to his excited retelling of the cat rescue. He should say something. About the smoke detector at least. But when he stepped outside, Sarah's tired smile stopped him. "Mr. Morrison, Marcus told me what you did. Thank you so much." "Frank," he corrected automatically. "And it was nothing. But, I noticed." "Mom," Marcus interrupted. "Can I show Frank my science project?" "It's late, honey. Mr. Morrison probably wants to rest." Frank saw the shadows under her eyes. Single mother working hospital shifts. Probably the last thing she needed was some old man giving her home maintenance advice. "Another time," he said. That night, Frank lay awake, listening to the sounds next door. Marcus's voice carrying through the thin walls, asking for another story. Sarah's gentle refusal, reminding him about school tomorrow. It reminded him of Danny, his own son, at that age. The years after Frank's father died in the steel mill accident. His mother working double shifts to keep food on the table. The memories came stronger at night. His mother's exhausted face. The neighbors who helped when they could, watched him after school. The retired mechanic next door who taught him to fix bikes and cars, gave him somewhere to go when his mother had to work. A door closed next door. Footsteps on stairs. Normal sounds that somehow made his own house feel emptier. He thought about the smoke detector in their kitchen. The missing downspout. Small things that could become big problems, things he knew how to fix. Maybe tomorrow he'd try again. Find a way to offer help that didn't sound like criticism. Share some of that knowledge built up over 40 years of keeping people safe. His knee ached, a constant reminder of his limitations. But today he climbed a tree, saved a cat, made a kid smile. It wasn't running into burning buildings anymore. But maybe it was something. The night settled around him, filled with the quiet sounds of two houses. One empty, one full of life. Frank closed his eyes, listening to Marcus's laughter through the wall. Tomorrow he'd check his garage. He probably still had some spare smoke detector batteries somewhere. Frank sat in his recliner, halfway through a crossword puzzle, when he heard the crash. Glass breaking. Then silence. His pen stopped mid-word. 3 years of retirement hadn't dulled 40 years of instinct. He counted seconds, waiting for what would come next. 1, 2, 3. A scream cut through the afternoon quiet. High-pitched, young. Frank was on his feet before the sound faded. Through his living room window, he saw it, smoke, black and thick, pouring from the Williams kitchen window. His hands shook as he grabbed his phone, muscle memory dialing 911. 911, what's your emergency? Fire at 1242, Oak Street. His voice shifted automatically into the clipped tones of his firefighting days. Smoke visible from first-floor kitchen window. At least one child trapped inside. Sir, I'm dispatching emergency services now. But with Station 39 closed, response time will be approximately 12 minutes. 12 minutes. Frank's stomach dropped. He knew what fire could do in 12 minutes. Another scream. Help! Somebody help! Frank dropped the phone. Through the thickening smoke, he saw Marcus at an upstairs window, pounding on the glass. The boy's face was streaked with tears, illuminated by the orange glow beginning to fill the house behind him. Neighbors spilled onto their lawns. Mrs. Patterson in her gardening clothes. Mr. Rodriguez running from his garage. Someone call 911. They're coming. Where's his mother? Hospital shift. Frank's feet carried him across his lawn, across the property line. Heat hit his face as he got closer. The kitchen window had shattered, flames licking out into the afternoon air. Marcus, he shouted. Can you get to the stairs? No. The boy's voice cracked with terror. There's fire everywhere. I can't breathe. Mrs. Chen grabbed Frank's arm. I just stepped out to get the mail. Just for a minute. Oh God. I just left for a minute. Smoke billowed thicker now. Black smoke, meaning plastic burning. Toxins. Every second Marcus spent breathing it. Stay back. Mr. Rodriguez tried to block Frank's path. Wait for the fire department. But Frank saw it all too clearly. 12 minutes. Structure fire doubles in size every 3 minutes. Do the math. The image flashed in his mind. 3 years ago. Another fire. Another scream. His knee giving out on the stairs, forcing him to watch helpless as. No, not this time. Frank, don't. Someone grabbed his jacket. He shrugged them off. The heat grew stronger as he approached the front door. Handle first, back of the hand, check for heat. Basic training. The metal was warm but not hot. Not yet. His knee trembled as he tested his weight on the front steps. The pain would come. He accepted it, pushed it aside like he'd been trained. Behind him, sirens wailed in the distance. But too far. Much too far. Frank took one deep breath of clean air. Counted to 3. 1. Check escape routes. Front door. Back door. Windows if necessary. 2. Assess the situation. Fire in kitchen, spreading fast. Smoke layer dropping. Clock ticking. 3. Make the call. Frank grabbed the door handle and pulled it open. A wall of heat and smoke hit him like a physical blow. No protective gear. No mask. No radio backup. Just an old man with a bad knee and 40 years of training screaming at him that this was suicide. But through the smoke, he heard Marcus cough. A wet, heavy sound that every firefighter knew and feared. Frank stepped through the doorway, into hell. The heat pressed against him immediately, trying to drive him back. Smoke rolled across the ceiling in thick waves, dropping lower by the second. The living room was still clear, but orange light pulsed from the kitchen doorway, and Frank could hear the distinctive crackling sound of fire eating through walls. Stay low. Check angles. Don't get boxed in. His body remembered the movement, the crouch walk that kept you under the smoke layer. His knee screamed as he moved deeper into the house. Marcus! Up here! The voice was weaker now. Bad sign. The stairs stretched up into darkness. Smoke so thick he could barely see the steps. The banister was hot under his palm. Behind him, the fire roared louder. The kitchen wall would go soon. Then the whole first floor would flash. Clock ticking. Frank put his foot on the first step. Pain shot through his knee, bright and immediate. The same pain that had dropped him 3 years ago. That had ended his career. That had left him watching helpless as another family's world burned. Please. Marcus's voice cracked into coughing. I'm scared. One step. Then another. Each one an argument with gravity and time and his own broken body. The smoke got thicker as he climbed. Frank pulled his shirt over his mouth, knowing it was useless. His eyes burned. His lungs burned. Everything burned. Halfway up, the wave of dizziness hit. Smoke inhalation. He knew the stages. Confusion would come next. Then unconsciousness. Clock ticking. The upper hallway was a black tunnel. Heat pressed down from above. The fire had reached the ceiling somewhere, was probably spreading through the crawl space. Marcus! Make noise! A thump answered him. Then another. Frank moved toward the sound, staying close to the wall. His fingers traced the wallpaper, counting doorways. The boys' room was at the end of the hall. Frank could see the orange glow reflecting off the smoke now. Fire in the walls. In the ceiling. Clock ticking. He found the door handle. Hot. Too hot. Marcus! Get back from the door. Frank wrapped his shirt around his hand and turned the handle. The door swung open on a nightmare. The window across the room had shattered from the heat. Fresh air fed the flames that crawled up the walls, across the ceiling. The smoke was so thick he could barely. There, a shape huddled in the corner. Small. Still. Marcus. The boy didn't respond. Frank crossed the room in 2 steps, ignoring the pain, ignoring everything but the need to reach that small, motionless form. Marcus was conscious but barely. His eyes were unfocused, his breathing shallow. When Frank touched his shoulder, he flinched. "I've got you, son. I've got you." Frank scooped the boy into his arms, too light, too limp. The ceiling creaked above them, a sound every firefighter knew. Structure failing. Support beams weakening. Clock ticking. Frank turned toward the door just as the ceiling gave way. Burning debris crashed down, blocking their exit. The heat was unbearable now, the smoke so thick he could barely see his own feet. Through the broken window, he heard sirens. Closer now, but not close enough. Marcus stirred in his arms, a weak cough shaking his small frame. Clock ticking. Frank looked at the window, judging the distance to the ground. 2 stories up. No good. The smoke was absolute now. His vision narrowed to pinpoints. His knee threatened to buckle with each step, but he could still hear Marcus breathing, still feel the boy's heart beating against his chest. Not this time, he thought. Not again. The flames roared closer, hungry for them both. Frank held Marcus tighter and looked for another way out. The clock kept ticking. The heat pressed against Frank's back as he carried Marcus through the smoke-filled hallway. Every breast burned. Every step sent daggers through his knee. But he kept moving. "Stay with me, kid." His voice was barely a whisper now, raw from the smoke. "Just stay with me." Marcus's only response was a weak cough. Bad sign. The boy's breathing was getting worse, each inhale a wet, rattling sound that Frank had heard too many times before. The stairs were somewhere ahead. Frank kept one hand on the wall, counting doorways again. The smoke was so thick he could barely see his own feet. A crash from below, something large falling in the kitchen. The whole house groaned around them, support beams weakening in the heat. Almost there. Frank wasn't sure if he was talking to Marcus or himself. Almost there. His fingers found empty space. The stairwell. But the heat rising from below hit like a physical wall. Frank dropped to his knees, keeping Marcus close to his chest. Stay low. That's what he taught in hundreds of fire safety presentations. The coolest air is near the floor. The first step down sent lightning through his bad knee. Frank bit back a curse. The second step was worse. Halfway down, the smoke thinned enough for him to see the horror below. The kitchen doorway was a solid sheet of flame. Fire had spread across the ceiling, dropping burning debris onto the furniture. No way out through the front door. The entire living room was an inferno. Marcus stirred in his arms. "Can't breathe." "I know, son. I know." Frank's own lungs screamed for clean air. His vision blurred at the edges. "Hold on. Think. Think." Secondary exits. Back door through the kitchen. No good. Windows. The dining room. It had a large bay window facing the backyard. If he could just... Another crash from the kitchen. The heat intensified as something else caught fire. Clock still ticking. Frank half crawled, half stumbled toward the dining room, keeping below the worst of the smoke. His knee gave out twice. Both times he forced himself back up. Marcus cradled against him. The dining room door was closed. Frank pressed his shirt-covered hand against it. Cool enough. He turned the handle with shaking fingers. The smoke wasn't as thick here. Through the bay window, he could see red and blue lights reflecting off neighboring houses. Help was close, but not close enough. Frank started toward the window, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. He stumbled, barely managing to turn his body to avoid crushing Marcus as they fell. The impact jarred his knee. The pain was blinding now, absolute. Frank tried to stand, but his legs simply wouldn't respond. "No," he growled. "Not here. Not like this." Marcus wasn't moving anymore. The boy's skin had taken on a gray tinge that Frank recognized from his worst nightmares. The window was less than 10 feet away. It might as well have been a mile. Frank started crawling, pulling himself across the floor with one arm while holding Marcus with the other. The carpet burned his palms, each movement sent fresh agony through his knee. A sound like thunder filled the house, the kitchen's ceiling collapsing. Heat and smoke poured through the dining room doorway. 5 feet to the window. 4. 3. Frank's vision narrowed to tunnels. The smoke was winning. His lungs couldn't pull in enough air. The memory hit him like a physical blow. 3 years ago. Another fire. Another victim. His knee giving out at the worst possible moment. Watching helpless as... No! The word came out as a roar. Not again. With the last of his strength, Frank lunged for the window. His shoulder hit the glass hard enough to crack it. Not enough. He needed something harder. His fingers found a dining room chair. Heavy oak. Sarah would have liked it. Frank swung the chair with everything he had left. The glass shattered outward in a glittering cascade. Cool air rushed in. Someone was shouting outside. Multiple voices now. Here! Frank tried to call out, but no sound came. His throat was raw, useless. He could hear the fire truck now. The distinctive sound of Engine 47's diesel engine. His old crew. Almost here. Almost wasn't good enough. The smoke was absolute again. Frank could feel consciousness slipping away. His body was shutting down, starved of oxygen. Marcus felt so light in his arms, too light. Too still. Sorry, Frank whispered to the boy. I'm so sorry. The flames reached the dining room doorway. The heat was unbearable now. Frank pulled Marcus closer, trying to shield him with his own body. This was it then. At least he'd tried. At least he hadn't. Strong hands grabbed him from behind. A familiar voice cut through the roar of the fire. I've got you, Cap. I've got you both. Johnson. His old lieutenant. The kid he'd trained himself. More hands. The world tilted as they pulled him toward the window. Glass crunched under his back. Get the boy first, Frank tried to say, but no words came out. They were lifting him now. Cool air on his face. The sound of sirens deafening. Marcus, he managed to gasp. Save. We've got him, Cap. Let go. We've got him. Frank's arms wouldn't release their grip on the boy. Some deep instinct wouldn't let him lose this one. Not like Frank. Johnson's voice again. Let us help. Let go. The world spun. Black spots danced in Frank's vision. The last thing he saw was Marcus being lifted away by familiar hands in turnout gear. Then darkness took him, and Frank Morrison, retired firefighter, widow, hero, fell into the void with empty arms and a silent prayer. The prayer was simple, primal. Not for himself. Just 4 words repeated in the darkness. Please let him live. Please let him live. Please let him live. Please. And then nothing but the sound of sirens and the memory of smoke. Frank's consciousness came in waves. Fragments of reality broke through the darkness. Rough hands lifting him. The scrape of a backboard against his spine. An oxygen mask pressed against his face. Stay with us, Cap. Johnson's voice again. The kid had always been too emotional. BP dropping. Get another line in. Cold liquid running into his arm. The sharp scratch of an 4 needle. Marcus. The word came out as a wheeze. The boy. They are working on him. Just stay still. Frank tried to turn his head, searching for Marcus through the chaos. Pain shot down his neck. Someone held him still. O2 stats falling. We're losing him. The mask pressed harder against his face. Pure oxygen flooded his burning lungs. Fight, Cap. You hear me? Fight. Frank wanted to tell Johnson to stop calling him Cap. Wanted to tell him about Marcus. About the other one. About darkness again. The ambulance siren cut through his consciousness. Different voices now. Male, 68, severe smoke inhalation, possible airway burns. Second-degree burns on hands and arms. Prior knee injury exacerbated. Frank forced his eyes open. White ceiling. Moving fast. Hospital lights flashing overhead. Marcus. His voice was gone, just a rasping whisper. A paramedic leaned into his field of vision. Young guy. Probably new. The boys in the other ambulance. Sir. They are right behind us. Tell me. You need to save your breath. Sir. Your airway's compromised. Frank grabbed the medic's arm. His grip was weak, but the young man stopped. Tell me. The paramedic hesitated. His critical but stable. They got him on high-flow oxygen. His fighting. Fighting. Good boy. More darkness. The emergency room was controlled chaos. Doctors shouting orders. Nurses moving with practiced efficiency. Get him to trauma 2. Call respiratory. Where's the burn unit? Frank felt them cutting away his clothes. Cold stethoscope on his chest. More needles. More voices. Sir? Mr. Morrison? Can you hear me? A doctor's face appeared above him. Female. Asian. About Sarah's age. Blink if you can hear me. Frank blinked. Good. We're going to take care of you, but I need you to stay calm. Your throat is swelling from the smoke. We may need to intubate. No. He needed to talk. Needed to tell them. Marcus. It came out as barely a whisper. The boy is in good hands. Dr. Chen is our best pediatric specialist. Promise. Sir, please don't try to talk. Promise, you'll save him. The doctor's eyes softened. We're doing everything we can. Now please, let us help you. Frank felt the darkness coming again. Fought it. Not like last time. Then nothing. Dreams came. Memories. Smoke and heat. A woman's scream. His knee giving out on the stairs. I'm sorry. Please. My baby. Standing helpless in the street as the upper floor flashed over. Johnson holding him back. You can't go in there, Cap. It's too late. Watching it all burn. The darkness lifted. Different room now. Quieter. Beeping machines. The hiss of oxygen. Sharp antiseptic smell. Frank opened his eyes. ICU. He recognized the layout. He'd been here too many times with injured crew members. His throat felt raw. Breathing hurt. But the tube was gone. That was something. Welcome back, Cap. Johnson sat in a chair by the bed. Still in his turnout pants and department t-shirt. Soot stains on his face. Mar. Frank couldn't finish the name. He's alive. Johnson leaned forward. Down the hall in pediatric ICU. They're monitoring his airway. But the doc says he's stable. Frank's chest loosened. Some weight lifted. Sarah. His mother's with him. She got here about an hour ago. Frank tried to sit up. Pain shot through his entire body. Easy. Johnson pushed him back. You've got second-degree burns on 15% of your body. And you messed up that knee again. Need to see. You need to rest. Johnson's voice got serious. You almost died, Cap. Both of you. If we'd been 2 minutes later. Frank closed his eyes. The memories came again. Smoke. Heat. A small body in his arms. How bad? Johnson sighed. The house is a total loss. Fire started in the kitchen. Looks like faulty wiring. Spread fast through the walls. The boy. Severe smoke inhalation. Some minor burns. But the doc says he's young. He'll bounce back. Johnson paused. You saved his life, Cap. If you hadn't gone in. Had to. Yeah. Johnson wiped his face. Yeah. I know. They sat in silence. Just the beeping of machines. You remember Thompson? Johnson finally asked. Frank nodded. The woman from 3 years ago. His last fire. Wasn't your fault, Cap. Never was. Frank turned his head away. His eyes burned. And not from the smoke. This one lived. Johnson's voice was soft. This one you saved. A nurse appeared in the doorway. Mr. Morrison? There's someone here to see you. Sarah Williams stood behind her. Eyes red from crying. Still in her hospital scrubs from her shift. I'll give you a minute. Johnson stood. Get some rest, Cap. Sarah approached the bed slowly. Frank tried to speak, but she held up her hand. Marcus is asking for you. Her voice broke. He keeps calling you his hero. Frank closed his eyes. Hero. He hadn't felt like one in 3 years. Thank you. Sarah grabbed his hand. Her grip was tight. Thank you for saving my boy. Frank squeezed back. His burned hands protested, but he didn't let go. Had to, he whispered. Had to try. Sarah wiped her eyes. The doctors say he'll make a full recovery. They say? They say if you hadn't gotten him out when you did. Don't. No. Listen. She gripped his hand harder. You risked your life for my son. You ran into that fire like it was my job. It's not your job anymore. But you did it anyway. Frank thought of Marcus. Of Thompson. Of 40 years of running into burning buildings. Always will be, he whispered. Always will be my job. Sarah smiled through her tears. Well, you've got a new job now. Marcus needs someone to talk to about this. Someone who understands. Frank nodded. He understood too well. Get some rest. Sarah squeezed his hand one last time. We'll be here when you wake up. As she left, Frank closed his eyes. His body ached. His lungs burned. His knee throbbed. But for the first time in 3 years, the weight on his chest felt a little lighter. In his dreams, there was still smoke. Still heat. Still screaming. But this time, when he reached through the flames, his hands found what they were searching for. This time, he didn't let go. The hospital room was too quiet. Frank stared at the ceiling, counting the dots in the acoustic tiles. 3 days since the fire. His throat still felt like he'd swallowed broken glass. The TV droned in the background. Some morning show he wasn't watching. A nurse had turned it on, saying the silence wasn't good for him. The door opened. Dr. Williams, no relation to Sarah, she told him, walked in with his chart. "How's the pain today, Mr. Morrison?" Frank held up 3 fingers. They'd worked out a system since talking hurt. "Better than yesterday." She checked his 4. "The burns are healing well. But your knee?" 5 fingers this time. "That's what I thought." She made a note. "The orthopedist wants to discuss surgery options." Frank shook his head. "Mr. Morrison, with the additional damage dash." "No." The word came out rough, but clear. The doctor sighed. "At least let us schedule a consultation." Frank closed his eyes. He knew what they'd say. Same thing they'd said 3 years ago. Surgery might help, might not. Risks at his age. Recovery time. Physical therapy. A commotion in the hallway interrupted them. Running feet. A familiar voice. "Mom, hurry up. He's this way." Marcus appeared in the doorway, Sarah right behind him. The boy wore hospital pajamas, an oxygen tube still under his nose. "Marcus." Dr. Williams turned. "You should be in bed." "But I wanted dash." A coughing fit cut him off. Sarah steadied him. "I'm sorry, doctor." He insisted on seeing Mr. Morrison. "Frank," he corrected automatically, voice rasping. Marcus grinned through his cough. "See, Mom? He's talking." Dr. Williams looked between them, then checked her watch. 5 minutes. "Then both my patients need rest." After she left, Marcus approached the bed slowly. His eyes widened at Frank's bandaged hands, the 4 lines, the monitors. "Does it hurt?" Frank shook his head. No point telling the kid about pain. "Liar." Marcus perched carefully on the edge of the bed. "Mom says you got burns saving me." "Marcus," Sarah warned. "Mr. Morrison needs dash." "Frank," he corrected again. "Frank needs to rest." "It's okay." Each word hurt, but he forced them out. "Pull up a chair." Sarah hesitated, then dragged 2 chairs closer. Marcus stayed on the bed. "I had a nightmare," the boy said suddenly. "About the fire." Frank knew that tone. He'd heard it from too many victims over the years. "Normal," he managed. "Mom says you used to be a firefighter. That you saved lots of people." Frank glanced at Sarah. She gave a small nod. "Long time. Were you scared? When you came to get me?" The question hung in the air. Frank thought about lying. About giving the brave hero answer. "Yes." Marcus's eyes widened. "But you came anyway. Had to. Why?" Frank looked at the boy's face. Saw the fear there. The need to understand. "Because," he forced the words out, "being scared doesn't matter when someone needs help." Another coughing fit hit Marcus. Sarah started to stand, but Frank held up his hand. "Normal," he said again. "Smoke. Takes time." "How long?" Marcus asked when he could breathe. "Depends. Week. Maybe 2. But it'll get better." Frank nodded. "Promise." A nurse appeared in the doorway. "Marcus, time for your breathing treatment." The boy's face fell. "But Dash, go on," Frank whispered. "Doctor's orders." Marcus slid off the bed reluctantly. At the door, he turned back. "Will you tell me about being a firefighter? When you can talk better." Frank managed a smile. "Deal." After they left, Frank closed his eyes. His throat burned from talking, but it was worth it. A soft knock made him look up. Johnson stood in the doorway, holding a paper cup. "Brought you some ice chips, Cap?" Frank gestured him in. The ice felt good on his raw throat. "Local news wants to interview you," Johnson said, settling into the chair Sarah had vacated. "Chief told them to wait." Frank nodded gratefully. "Whole department's talking about it." Johnson leaned forward. "Running into a burning building at your age. No gear. Bad knee. You're either the bravest son of a bitch I know or the craziest." "Both." Johnson laughed. "Yeah, probably." His face turned serious. "You could have died, Cap. Worth it." "Yeah." Johnson stood, adjusting his uniform. "Yeah, I guess it was." That night, the nightmares came again. But different this time. Still smoke. Still heat. Still terror. But instead of failure, he remembered success. Instead of loss, salvation. A nurse woke him for vital checks. Found his hands clenched in the sheets. Bad dreams. Frank shook his head. Not bad. Just memories. The next morning, Sarah came alone. She looked tired. Hospital fluorescents weren't kind to anyone. Marcus is sleeping, she said, taking the chair. Finally. The night maze. Take time, Frank managed. The doctors say he'll need therapy. She twisted her hands in her lap. To process the trauma. Frank nodded. Standard procedure. Would you? She hesitated. Would you talk to him? About what happened? He trusts you. Not qualified. You're exactly qualified. Sarah met his eyes. You've been there. You understand what he's going through. Frank thought about it. About 40 years of fires. Of rescues and losses. Of nightmares and healing. Okay. Sarah reached for his hand, careful of the burns. Thank you. They sat in comfortable silence. Just the beeping of monitors. The insurance adjuster came yesterday, she finally said. The house? There's not much left. Frank remembered the heat. The way the fire had moved through the walls. Stay with friends. Sarah shook her head. We'll find a hotel. Something temporary until Dash. My house. What? Stay. With me. The words hurt, but he pushed through. Plenty of room. Frank, we couldn't Dash, please. He grabbed her hand tighter. Been alone? Too long. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Let me think about it. Frank nodded. It was enough for now. That afternoon, Marcus snuck in again. This time with contraband. Mom got me ice cream, he whispered, showing Frank the chocolate-stained cup. Want some? Frank shook his head, smiling. The doctors say I can go home soon. Marcus stirred the melting ice cream. Except, we don't have a home anymore. Yes, you do. Marcus looked up. Mom told you about the fire? How it burned everything. My house. Frank took a painful breath. Big enough? 4-3. The boy's face lit up. Really? We could stay with you. Frank nodded. Like a family. The word hit Frank in the chest. Family. He hadn't had that in a long time. If you want. Marcus carefully put his ice cream down and hugged Frank. Mindful of the burns, the 4 lines, everything. Thank you, he whispered. For saving me. For everything. Frank hugged back, ignoring the pain in his hands. For the first time in 3 years, his empty house didn't feel like a ghost anymore. It felt like a possibility. That night, in the quiet dark of his hospital room, Frank Morrison made plans. The spare rooms would need cleaning. The kitchen would need stocking. His knee would need time. But for the first time since Sarah died, since Thompson, since retirement, he had a purpose again. Not running into burning buildings anymore. But maybe, just maybe, building something new from the ashes. Family. It was worth the pain. Worth the fear. Worth everything. Frank closed his eyes, listening to the quiet beeping of monitors. Tomorrow, he'd start talking to Marcus about the fire. About being scared. About being brave anyway. Tonight, he just listened to the sound of his own breathing. In and out. Smoke damage but healing. Like everything else, Frank stood in his spare bedroom, leaning on his cane, surveying the space. Boxes of Sarah's old things lined the walls. Photo albums, Christmas decorations. A life packed away in cardboard. We can find a hotel, Sarah said from the doorway. Really? It's not Dash, no. Frank's voice was stronger now, 2 weeks after the fire. Just need to clear it out. Marcus poked his head around his mother. Can I help? Frank nodded. Careful with the boxes. They worked together, the 3 of them. Frank directing from a chair while Sarah and Marcus moved boxes to the garage. His hands were still healing, and his knee screamed if he stood too long. What's this? Marcus held up a dusty trophy. Firefighting competition. Team speed drill. Frank smiled at the memory. Long time ago. You won. 2nd place. Frank pointed to the engraving. Lost to Station 39. The one they closed. Frank nodded. Marcus carefully placed the trophy on a shelf. By evening, the room was clear. Just furniture now. Bed, dresser, desk. Sarah insisted on changing the sheets herself. It's too much, she said for the 10th time. You're still recovering. So are you. Frank watched her tuck hospital corners with practiced efficiency. Both of you. Marcus sat on the floor, going through a box of old firefighting photos Frank had let him keep. Is this you? He held up a yellowed picture. Frank took it carefully. Young guy in turnout gear, grinning at the camera. No gray hair. No lines around his eyes. First year on the job. You look different. Frank laughed, then coughed. His lungs were still healing too. Was different. That night, the screaming woke him. Frank was moving before he was fully awake. His knee buckled as he reached for his cane. No, please. I can't breathe. Marcus's voice. The nightmare voice. Frank found him tangled in sheets, thrashing. Sarah was already there, trying to wake him. Marcus, honey, wake up. You're safe. The boy's eyes snapped open, wild with terror. The smoke, he gasped. I couldn't dash. Breathe with me. Frank sat on the edge of the bed. In through the nose. Marcus followed his lead. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The same breathing exercises the hospital had taught them both. The dreams, Marcus said finally. When do they stop? Frank thought about lying. Thought about easy answers. They change, he said instead. Get easier to handle. Promise. Promise. Sarah brought water. They sat together, listening to the night sounds of the house. Want to hear about my first fire? Frank asked. Marcus nodded eagerly. Was scared out of my mind. Frank settled back against the headboard. Rookie. First week on the job. He talked until Marcus fell asleep. Sarah stayed too, listening. Thank you, she whispered as they left the room. Frank shrugged. Been there. The nightmares. You still have them? Sometimes. Sarah touched his arm. You don't have to be alone with them anymore. Frank nodded, not trusting his voice. Days fell into a routine. Morning breathing exercises. Physical therapy for Frank's knee. Marcus's homeschool lessons while they waited for the new school year. Sarah worked night shifts at the hospital. Frank stayed up, keeping Marcus company when the dreams came. Tell me about the people you saved, Marcus would ask. So Frank told him. The good calls. The lives changed. The victories that made the losses bearable. One morning, Sarah found them asleep in front of the TV, old firefighting documentaries playing. You need rest, she scolded Frank. I rest? Really? Because your physical therapist says dash. I'm fine. Sarah put her hands on her hips. Don't make me pull rank. I'm a nurse. Remember. Frank grumbled but let her help him to bed. The physical therapist came 3 times a week. Young guy named Steve who didn't take no for an answer. Push through it, he'd say, working Frank's knee. No pain, no gain. Hate that saying, Frank growled. But he pushed. Did the exercises. Used the cane. Marcus watched sometimes, doing the movements along with Frank. Does it hurt? He'd ask. Yes. Then why do it? Because, Frank grunted through another rep, getting stronger, hurts sometimes. Marcus thought about that. Like talking about the fire. Exactly like that. They talked about the fire in pieces. Small doses that didn't overwhelm. I heard the glass break, Marcus said one day. In the kitchen. Frank nodded, encouraging. I was doing homework. Smelled smoke. His voice got smaller. I ran upstairs instead of out. Natural reaction. They taught us not to hide. Marcus picked at his shirt. In school. Fire safety week. Fear makes us forget. Were you scared? When you couldn't find me? Frank remembered the smoke. The heat. The terror. Terrified. But you kept looking. Always will. Marcus hugged him then. Quick and fierce. Sarah found them going through more boxes later. Photo albums this time. Who's this? Marcus held up a picture. Frank's chest tightened. Sarah. Here's Sarah. In their garden. My wife. She's pretty. Marcus studied the photo. Where is she? Heaven, Frank said quietly. 3 years ago. Marcus put the photo down carefully. Like my dad. Sarah made a small sound. Yeah, Frank said. Like that. They sat with that truth for a while. I miss him, Marcus finally said. Even though I don't remember him much. That's okay. Frank put his arm around the boy. Missing people? It's how we keep them with us. Sarah wiped her eyes. I should start dinner. Pizza, Frank said suddenly. What? Let's get pizza. He struggled to his feet. Too many memories tonight. Need pizza? Marcus jumped up. Can we get stuffed crust? Whatever you want. They ate in the living room, breaking Sarah's usual rules. Watch bad TV. Laughed at commercials. Making new memories to sit alongside the old ones. Later, Frank found Sarah on the back porch. She had Sarah's photo. "I'm sorry," she said. "We're intruding on her space." "No." Frank sat heavily in the other chair. "She'd like this." "You sure?" "She always wanted grandkids." Frank smiled at the photo. "House was too quiet after our kids moved out." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Marcus called you Grandpa today, when he was talking to Mrs. Chen." "Oh." "I told him not to dash." "It's okay." Frank's voice was rough. "More than okay." They sat in comfortable silence, looking at stars. "The insurance company called," Sarah finally said. "About rebuilding." Frank's chest tightened. "Oh, but maybe." She hesitated. "Maybe we could stay. Help with the house? Keep you company?" "Yes." The word came instantly. "Please." Sarah reached over and squeezed his hand. Inside, they could hear Marcus laughing at the TV. "Family," Frank said softly. "Family," Sarah agreed. That night, when the nightmares came, they faced them together. Not alone anymore. Any of them. Just a family, building something new from ashes and memories and love. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Marcus stood in front of his fifth-grade class, hands steady as he held up the firefighter's helmet. Frank's old helmet, polished for the occasion. "This is rated to withstand temperatures up to 500 degrees, Marcus explained. The reflective coating helps protect the firefighter from radiant heat. Frank watched from the back of the classroom, leaning on his cane. Sarah had taken a Ray Day shift so she could be there too. "Any questions?" Marcus asked. 20 hands shot up. "Did you really get saved by a firefighter? Was it scary? Did everything burn up?" Marcus handled each question like a pro. Frank had helped him practice all week. "Yes, I was scared," Marcus said. "But I learned that being scared doesn't matter when someone needs help. Mr. Morrison taught me that." Frank's chest tightened at the slip. After the presentation, Marcus's teacher pulled them aside. "That was incredible," she said. "Would you be willing to do this for other classes? We're starting our fire safety unit." Marcus looked at Frank, eyes hopeful. "Could we?" Frank nodded. Important message. The drive home was quiet. Marcus held the helmet in his lap, running his fingers over the scratches and dents. "Did good today," Frank said. "Really?" Marcus perked up. "I remembered everything you told me about the gear." "Not just that." Frank stopped at a red light. "Talking about it. The fire. Takes courage. Like running into a burning building. Different kind. Same importance." Sarah squeezed Frank's shoulder from the back seat. They pulled into the driveway to find Mrs. Patterson from next door waiting with a casserole. "For your freezer," she said, handing it to Sarah. "Lord knows you worked too hard at that hospital." The neighbors had been like this since the fire. Food appeared regularly. Mr. Rodriguez mowed Frank's lawn without being asked. Mrs. Chen brought Chinese dumplings every Sunday. Inside, they found more gifts. A hand-knit blanket for Marcus. Gift cards for groceries. "People are so kind," Sarah said, putting the casserole away. Frank watched Marcus arrange his school things. Community takes care of its own. That evening, as Sarah prepared for her night shift, Frank heard voices at the door. "Dad?" "Hello." His son David stood on the porch. Karen, his daughter, right behind him. "Surprise." Karen hugged him. "We saw the news. The fire. Why didn't you call us?" "Was busy," Frank mumbled. "Too busy to tell us you almost died." David's voice was sharp. "Again." Marcus appeared in the hallway. "Is everything okay?" Frank took a breath. "Marcus, meet my kids. David, Karen, this is Marcus." And his mother Sarah. Awkward silence filled the entryway. "Well," Karen finally said, "this is unexpected." "They are staying here," Frank said firmly. "Long as they need." David opened his mouth. Closed it. "Can we talk? Privately?" In the kitchen, David exploded in whispers. "What are you thinking? Taking in strangers? After what happened last time, Dash." "Not strangers," Frank cut him off. "Family. Family." Karen's voice cracked. "Dad, Mom's only been gone 3 years. Not replacing her." Frank gripped his cane tighter. "Making something new? By running into burning buildings at your age?" David ran a hand through his hair. "The doctors said your knee dash. Had to." "No, you didn't." David's whisper became a hiss. "You're not a firefighter anymore, Dad. You need to accept that." Frank straightened. ignoring the pain in his knee. Always will be. Dad dash no. Frank's voice was quiet but firm. Listen, both of you? His children fell silent. Lost your mother. Lost my job. Lost myself for a while. Frank took a breath. Found something new. Something good. But dash. They need me. Frank looked at his children. I need them. Karen's eyes filled with tears. We need you too, Dad. Alive. I am alive. Frank smiled slightly. More than I've been in years. From the living room, they heard Marcus laugh at something Sarah said. Just. David sighed. Be careful, okay? Always. Karen hugged him again. Mom would want you to be happy. I know. They ordered Chinese food. Sat around the dining room table like a real family. Marcus peppered David with questions about growing up with a firefighter father. Karen showed Sarah old photos on her phone. He's always been a hero, Karen said, showing a picture of young Frank in uniform. Even before the job. Still is, Marcus said through a mouthful of noodles. Sarah had to leave for her shift. Don't wait up, she told Marcus. I'll stay, Frank said. Help with homework. David and Karen exchanged looks. After Sarah left, Marcus spread his math book on the kitchen table. Frank sat beside him, explaining fractions. You're good at this, Karen observed. Had practice. Frank tapped the book. Your mother was a teacher. Remember? More looks between his children. Later, after Marcus went to bed, they sat in the living room. Old habits. Old positions. You seem different, David said. I'm different. Happy. Karen added. You seem happy. Frank thought about it. About empty rooms now filled with life. About nightmares faced together. About family. I'm happy. They left late, promising to visit more often. Really meaning it this time. Frank locked up, checked on Marcus. The boy slept peacefully. No nightmares tonight. In the quiet house, Frank found himself in front of Sarah's photo. They're good kids, he told her. Marcus and David, Karen. All of them. The photo smiled back. You'd like Sarah too. Strong woman. Good mother. Frank touched the frame. Miss you. Always will. But. He looked toward Marcus's room. Not alone anymore. None of us are. That night, Frank slept without dreams good or bad. Morning brought chaos. Marcus running late for school. Sarah stumbling in from her shift. Frank trying to make breakfast one-handed while his knee complained. Normal chaos. Family chaos. Grandpa, Marcus called from the hallway. Have you seen my science book? Frank froze. Sarah's coffee cup stopped halfway to her mouth. Sorry, Marcus said quickly. I meant dash. Under the couch, Frank said. Saw it there last night. Marcus retrieved the book, hugged them both. Ran for the bus. He didn't mean dash, Sarah started. It's okay. Frank poured more coffee. More than okay. Sarah smiled. You're sure? Family chooses itself sometimes. She touched his arm. Yes. Yes, it does. The day unfolded like others. Physical therapy. Lunch. Nap for Sarah. School bus. But something had shifted. Settled into place. Frank watched Marcus do homework at the kitchen table. Heard Sarah singing in the shower. Smelled dinner starting to cook. His house didn't feel empty anymore. Didn't echo with memories. New sounds. New smells. New life. Family. Different than before. But maybe that was okay. Maybe that was exactly how it was supposed to be. In the evening, they watched TV together. Marcus fell asleep against Frank's shoulder. Should wake him, Sarah said. Get him to bed. Few more minutes. She smiled knowingly. Frank sat there, feeling Marcus breathe. Listening to Sarah fold laundry. Family sounds. Home sounds. The kind of sounds that heal better than any medicine. The kind of sounds that make a house a home. The kind of sounds he'd thought he'd never hear again. But here they were. And here he was. Living. Breathing. Healing. Together. 1 year. Frank sat in the auditorium of Marcus's school, program crumpling in his hands. 1 year since the fire. Sarah squeezed his arm. They are starting. The principal approached the microphone. Today, we honor a student who turned personal tragedy into community service. Marcus Williams created our school's first comprehensive fire safety program. Frank watched Marcus walk onto the stage. The boy wore a dress shirt and tie. Looked taller somehow. Thanks to Marcus's initiative, The principal continued, every student now knows the importance of fire safety. His presentations, developed with help from retired fire captain Frank Morrison, have reached over 500 students in our district. The audience applauded. Frank saw Mrs. Chen wiping her eyes in the front row. Marcus stepped up to the microphone. His hands shook slightly, but his voice was steady. A year ago, I almost died in a house fire. Direct. No sugarcoating. Frank had taught him that. I made mistakes. I ran upstairs instead of out. I hid in a closet. I forgot everything I'd learned about fire safety. The auditorium was silent. But someone saved me. Someone who didn't have to. Who risked his life because that's who he is. Marcus looked straight at Frank. My grandfather taught me that being scared doesn't matter when someone needs help. Frank's chest tightened at the word grandfather. No hesitation now. No correction. So I started this program. Because knowledge saves lives. Because everyone needs to know what to do when they are scared. Because heroes aren't just people who run into burning buildings. They are people who make sure the fire never happens in the first place. More applause. Sarah gripped Frank's hand. The principal returned with a plaque. The Bernard Harris Community Service Award, presented to Marcus Williams. Marcus accepted it, grinning. Then he did something unexpected. Can my grandfather come up? Please. Frank froze. Sarah nudged him. Go on. His knee protested as he stood. The cane clicked against the floor as he made his way to the stage. Marcus helped him up the stairs. Handed him the plaque. This belongs to both of us, Marcus said into the microphone. Frank stared at the award. Thought about another piece of metal, gathering dust in his garage. Second place, speed drill. Didn't seem important anymore. The ceremony ended. People crowded around, congratulating them. Such a wonderful program, Mrs. Patterson gushed. The whole neighborhood feels safer, Mr. Rodriguez added. Frank watched Marcus handle it all. Confident, strong, different from the scared boy he'd carried from the flames. Later, at home, they celebrated with pizza. Sarah's night off. Special occasion. Speech. Sarah called as Marcus cut the cake. The boy blushed. Already did one today. Different audience, Frank said. Different speech. Marcus thought for a moment. Okay, but you have to do one too. Deal. Marcus stood, pizza in one hand, cake in the other. A year ago, we lost our house. But we found a home. He looked at Frank. Found family. Sarah wiped her eyes. Your turn, Grandpa. Frank cleared his throat. Not good at speeches. Try. Marcus encouraged. Frank looked at them. His family. Not what he'd expected. Better than he could have imagined. A year ago, he started. House was empty. Life was empty. He took a breath. Not anymore. That's it. Marcus grinned. Said I wasn't good at speeches. They laughed. Normal. Easy. Family. After dinner, Frank found Marcus in the backyard, staring at the stars. Penny for your thoughts. They're rebuilding the house, Marcus said. Next door. Insurance finally approved everything. Frank's chest tightened. Oh, Mom says we should move back when it's done. Silence stretched between them. What do you think? Frank finally asked. Marcus kicked at the grass. I don't want to. No. This is home now. The boy looked up. You're here. Frank pulled him close. One-armed hug. Always will be. Inside, Sarah was loading the dishwasher. Everything okay? Tell her, Frank nudged Marcus. I want to stay. The words came out in a rush. Here, with Grandpa. Sarah stopped, plate in hand. Marcus, please, Mom? The new house, it won't be the same anyway. And Grandpa needs us. Need each other, Frank corrected. Sarah put the plate down carefully. I was going to talk to you both about this. The insurance money, it's enough for a down payment. We could add on here instead. Make this house work for all of us. Really? Marcus bounced on his toes. If that's what everyone wants. Frank thought about his empty house. About Sarah's photo watching over them. About family. Yes, he said simply. Marcus hugged them both. That night, Frank couldn't sleep. Too much emotion. Too many memories. He drove to Station 47. Shift change. 7:45 a.m. Engine 47 backed in, fresh from a call. Johnson hopped down from the driver's seat. Cap, what brings you by? Frank gestured to Marcus in the passenger seat of his truck. Kid wanted to see where it all started. Johnson grinned. Tall. Marcus practically vibrated with excitement. They walked through the station. Frank's old locker. The kitchen where he'd eaten 1,000 meals. The pole he'd slid down for 40 years. This was your life? Marcus asked. Part of it. Frank watched the new crew going about their routine. Good part, but not the best part. Frank thought about empty rooms now filled with life. About nightmares faced together. About family found in ashes. Not anymore. They drove home as the sun rose. Marcus fell asleep against the window. Frank took the long way. Past the construction site that would become Sarah and Marcus's new house. Past the closed Station 39. Life changed. Always changing. But some things stayed. Love. Family. The need to help. At a red light, Frank looked at Marcus. The boy who'd given him back his purpose. His family. His life. Worth every burn. Every pain. Every nightmare. Worth everything. The light turned green. Frank drove on. Toward home. Toward family. Toward the future. Not the life he'd planned. Better than that. The life he'd found in the flames. The one he'd been searching for all along. Home.